Literary Snippets is a literal original show where we provide snippets of information about a literary work. Today's literary work is Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. Before we get into the novel, let us see a brief introduction of Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is a Bildungsroman which tells the experiences of Jane Eyre starting from her childhood to her adulthood. The story is a first-person narrative told from the perspective of the title character. We see the story unfold through her eyes. The novel also traces Jane's moral and spiritual development. The publication date for the novel is October 16, 1847, and it has 38 chapters. It was initially published in 3 volumes, and the 38 chapters were more or less equally divided among the 3 volumes. We see 5 distinct stages of Jane's life in the novel. The first stage is at Gateshead Hall, where Jane spends her childhood. The second stage is when she enters Lowood School and goes through her education. During the third stage of her life, she becomes a governess to Adele at Thornfield Hall. The fourth stage is when she spends her time in the Moor House and meets the clergyman St. John Rivers. The fifth and final stage of Jane's life is when she returns to Edward's side and reunites with him. Now we will take a look at the main characters in the novel. Jane Eyre is the protagonist narrator of the novel. She is an orphan and is as resourceful and as self-reliant as many of the famous female protagonists of the time. She takes on the job of a school mistress. Mrs. Reed is Jane's aunt. She is the mistress of Gateshead Hall and is a cold-hearted woman. Edward Fairfax Rochester is the master of Thornfield Manor. He always broods in the novel. Adele Warrens is Rochester's ward. She is a beautiful half-French girl who is also precocious. Mrs. Fairfax is the chief housekeeper of Thornfield Manor. She is Rochester's relative. Grace Poole is a servant who works under Mrs. Fairfax. Blanche Ingram is a snobbish woman who loves Rochester. She is beautiful and self-assured. Mr. Mason is a mysterious visitor to Thornfield Manor and he comes from the West Indies. And finally, St. John Rivers is a clergyman from the parish of Morton. He befriends Jane in the novel. Now let us see how the story unfolds in the novel. Jane Eyre is orphaned as a baby and is placed under the care and protection of Mr. and Mrs. Reed. Mrs. Reed is a cold-hearted mistress of Gateshead Hall. Mr. Reed is the brother of Jane's mother. On his deathbed, he instructs his wife to take care of Jane with the same tenderness that she would show her own children. Mrs. Reed, being a somber and severe woman, ignores her husband's request. Jane spends the first 10 years of her life with misery at her aunt's house. Mrs. Reed pampers her 3 children, which makes them spoiled. One day, Jane gets into a fight with one of Mrs. Reed's spoiled children. As a result, Jane gets punished by her aunt. She is thrust into the room where Mr. Reed died. Being a highly imaginative child, Jane becomes petrified at the thought of Mr. Reed's ghost haunting her. She faints and becomes very ill as a result. Bessie Leaven, who is a nurse at Gateshead, nurses Jane back to health. Jane is then sent by her aunt to Lowood School, which is 50 miles away from Gateshead Hall. Jane's school life is an austere one at Lowood. Despite the rigid circumstances at school, Jane becomes relieved after knowing that she doesn't have to undergo the same misery she did at Gateshead Hall. Jane becomes friends with Miss Temple, which induces her to learn her lessons rapidly. But soon after, a tragedy strikes Lowood School when some of the girls die due to an epidemic. The epidemic leads to an investigation into the conditions at school. As a result, the investigation brings forth improvements to the school's condition. After finishing her school education, Jane becomes a teacher at Lowood School but leaves soon after at the age of 18 in order to play the role of a governess to Adele Warrens. Jane becomes a governess to Adele Warrens, a precocious child who lives in Thornfield Manor near Millcote. Adele is a ward to Edward Rochester, whom Jane doesn't get to meet upon her arrival at Thornfield Manor. Instead, Jane is welcomed by the chief housekeeper, Mrs. Fairfax. Once again, Jane goes through a change in her life when she finds contentment at Thornfield Manor. She finds the rustic life appealing. Mrs. Fairfax warns Jane not to enter the locked room on the 3rd floor. Jane is puzzled after finding out about the mysterious locked room. One day, Jane hears a shrill laugh coming from the locked room on the 3rd floor. When she makes an inquiry about the laughter, Mrs. Fairfax pretends as though the maniacal laugh was made by Grace Poole, who was a short, stout and unattractive servant at the mansion. While walking outside, Jane has her first meeting with Edward. He gets thrown off by his horse and his dog seeks Jane for help. Seeing that Edward is hurt, Jane offers to help him reach the mansion. But he refuses Jane's help despite being in great pain. Edward questions Jane and learns about her position as Adele's governess. During their conversation, Edward's overbearing manner turns and becomes gracious. Edward tells Jane in confidence that he is Adele's father and that her mother is a French ballerina who deserted Edward and left Adele with him a long time ago. One night, Jane is awakened to the same scream she heard before. She opens her door and sees smoke emanating from Edward's room. She finds that his bed has caught on fire. She awakens Edward and saves him from the fire. Afterwards, he prohibits Jane from awakening the household. Edward blames Grace Poole for the fire by saying that she caused the fire during her periodic fits of insanity. The people in the household are told that the fire was accidental and was caused by a candle. After the incident, Jane senses Edward's suffering and believes that the incident would have been the consequences of a past sin. She feels sympathy for him, which gradually turns into love. Edward attends various parties in the neighborhood and begins to court Blanche Ingram. Blanche is a beautiful and frivolous woman. Jane's hopes of finding love are thwarted after the courtship. A party is thrown by Edward at Thornfield Manor. Blanche and her friends arrive at the party and treat Jane with hearty condescension. Jane feels that she can never win against people like Ingram, who are snobbish and elegant. Mr. Mason arrives at the party. Soon after, Jane hears a scuffle and a cry from the room above hers. The entire household is thrown into a panic, but Edward manages to calm everyone down. He privately asks Jane to nurse Mr. Mason, who was bleeding and unconscious. Mr. Mason is carried away from Thornfield Manor without anyone's notice. A day passes. Jane is in an orchard enjoying the lovely midsummer evening. Edward arrives there and informs her that he is soon to be married. Jane becomes miserable, assuming that he intends to marry Blanche Ingram. She sheds tears and tells Edward that under the circumstances, she cannot remain as governess at Thornfield Manor. Edward tells her that his wish is to marry her after kissing her. Days before the wedding, Jane's happy excitement is interrupted. One night, she awakens in horror after seeing a strange, ugly woman trying on Jane's bridal veil and then tearing it to pieces. Edward quickly assures her that it was only a bad dream. In the morning, Jane finds ripped fragments of her bridal veil. On the day of the wedding, Mr. Mason slips into the church and interrupts the wedding service. He announces that the marriage is illegal since Edward has a living wife. Edward is forced to reveal the truth behind his marriage. He takes Jane to the forbidden chamber on the third floor. Jane witnesses a hideous creature who was crawling on all fours in her madness. She realizes that the mad woman was behind the attack on Mason as well as the ripped fragments of her wedding veil. Edward explains that the woman is Mason's sister named Bertha. He says that he was tricked into marrying her 15 years ago when he was in Jamaica. He did not know that she came from a family of lunatics and degenerates. His married life with her was an unmitigated hell. Bertha has been locked in the room and is looked after by Grace Poole. Jane departs from Edward, putting an end to their love life. Jane takes little money with her and wanders about the Midland moors while vainly seeking employment. She comes close to starvation when a clergyman named St. John Rivers befriends her and nurses her back to health. She also meets two sisters, Mary and Diana. After recovering from starvation, she changes her name to Jane Elliot and finds a job as the village schoolmistress. She tries to forget Edward and her hopeless love for him. John Rivers finds out that John Eyre, Jane's uncle, has recently passed away, leaving £20,000 to Jane. Jane insists on sharing the legacy with John Rivers, Mary and Diana. He proposes marriage to Jane and tells her that he will be traveling to India to become a missionary. Even though he is not in love with her, he sees her as an admirable assistant who will aid him in his mission. While considering John's offer of marriage, Jane has a dream in which Edward calls for her. She goes back to Thornfield and is shocked to find that the house is in ruins, which was caused by a fire. She goes to a local inn and makes enquiries. She discovers that Mrs. Rochester set the house on fire one night. Edward saves the servants by leading them to safety. When he goes back to save his wife, she eludes him and climbs the roof. She then plunges to her death. While trying to escape from the fire, Edward gets crushed by a flaming staircase. He gets blinded and one of his arms gets amputated, but he manages to get out alive. The blind, one-armed Edward is now living in solitude at a nearby mansion in Ferndean. Jane hurries to see him. After reuniting with her, Edward becomes overjoyed and asks her to become his wife. Jane happily accepts the proposal and they get married. Soon after, they end up having a child. 2 years later, Edward regains the sight in one of his eyes. Now, let us see the critical opinion of the novel. Charlotte Bronte lacked the ironic aloofness from the world which Jane Austen possessed. Instead, Charlotte's works are infused with passionate involvement and poetic imagination. They even sometimes border on the melodramatic, losing a touch of realism. Charlotte's hopeless love for Hedger seems to be the basis for Jane's romantic interest in Edward. As a typical romantic hero, Edward shares significant traits with Heathcliff from Wuthering Heights. His sorrows are towering and his anger is vast. He is tormented as well as tormenting. He is not tempted by the superficialities of high society. He is tender and ruthless at times. He seems more like the figment of a romantic girl's imagination, the romantic girl here being Charlotte Bronte. The events which occur at Lowood School are autobiographical. Charlotte borrows elements from Gothic romance, which became popular as a genre during the late 18th century. Stock literary devices found in Gothic novels, such as an isolated mansion which is ghost-ridden and an innocent self-reliant girl who arrives to solve the mystery, are all found in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. Charlotte gives these devices a new lease on life by investing her unique passion and energy into the novel. Moreover, her experiences living in the lonely and haunted Haworth parsonage turns fictional cliches into living facts. Her real experiences give a unique touch and flavor to the novel Jane Eyre. As a result, the Gothic elements found in the novel seem more convincing than her predecessors who deal with the same genre of Gothic romance. That's about it for today. Thank you for watching this episode. See you on the next episode of Literary Snippets, where we will take a look at another literary work. Like and share this video if you like it. Subscribe to Literary Broadcast if you are new to our channel. Visit our website literary.in. We have 2 courses available right now. The first is a course on the history of English literature and the second is a course on literary criticism. Thank you and goodbye.